Olá, boa noite. Boa noite a todos que estão acompanhando o evento, mais um evento do Tech Law do IEA. Hello, everyone who is watching this webinar, and good evening, Professor Michael Geist. It's a great pleasure and honor to have this opportunity to hear you about an important issue, the challenge of internet regulation, Canada's struggle to find a balance between online rules and freedom of expressions. On behalf of IEA, Institute, Advanced Studies Institute in English, Instituto de Estudos Avançados, da USP, and the coordinators of this group, Professor Evandro and Professor Cristina, I would like to thank you, Professor Michael Geist, for sharing this knowledge with us tonight. I'd also to thank Thais, Rafael, and João from IEA, who give us this great support to develop these activities of the group. I do excuse myself so I can introduce you, Professor Michael Geist, to the Brazilian public in Portuguese, but as everybody knows, this webinar will be in English. So, agora eu vou falar em português para apresentar o professor Michael Geist, o professor com quem eu tive a honra de estudar no ano de 2006, na Universidade de Ottawa, no Canadá, quando eu fiz o doutorado sanduíche. E o professor Michael Geist é um professor muito conhecido, né, pelos seus trabalhos, artigos, capítulos de livros, e, inclusive, ele tem uma formação, assim, muito ampla, né? Ele se formou na Kobe University Faculty of Law, ele tem LLM in Commercial and European Union Law at University of Cambridge, e também ele fez LLM na Columbia University School of Law e doutorado na Columbia University. O professor, ele é full professor na Universidade de Ottawa, no Canadá, desde 2012 até hoje, né? E antes ele também era professor lá na universidade, professor associado, e ele tem uma variedade enorme de premiações no seu currículo, né? Só para vocês terem uma ideia, ele recebeu 3 vezes o prêmio entre os 25 advogados mais influenciadores do Canadá, e ele foi o diretor também do Centro de Tecnologia, Law and Society, de 2009 a 2016, onde eu pude pesquisar. Então, eu recomendo vocês fortemente a darem uma olhada, acessarem o blog do professor Michael Geist, né, michaelgeist.ca, e nesse blog vocês vão poder ter acesso aos maravilhosos artigos e capítulos de livros, que muitos estão disponíveis no blog, outros vocês podem ter a referência e conseguir essas versões digitais, né? E eu queria também algumas instruções passar para vocês. Se vocês, para fazerem perguntas, fiquem à vontade, use o nosso chat, façam a pergunta em inglês, se quiser fazer a pergunta em português, a gente faz a tradução para o professor Michael Geist, e aqueles, para terem certificados, vocês precisam clicar no link do YouTube para preencher um formulário como se fosse uma lista de presença, para que vocês possam ter o certificado. Então, eu não vou mais me alongar para a gente poder aproveitar o conhecimento do professor Michael Geist. So, now I give the floor to Professor Michael Geist, so everybody will enjoy and learn directly from him. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I can't say that I recognize my name in there, but not a whole lot other than that. But nevertheless, I appreciate the introduction, and I really appreciate the invitation. I'm happy to do it by webinar. I would be even happier to be doing it in Brazil. Hopefully, we will all find ourselves in a world soon when we have enough distribution of vaccines that life can return to normal. I've had the chance to visit Rio de Janeiro on a couple of occasions, and the chance to go back to visit Brazil again would be wonderful. So here's hoping that we all have that opportunity sometime soon. So I really do appreciate the chance both to speak to you and to speak about this topic in particular. Now, I know that you generally have been focused on artificial intelligence, on AI issues, and coming at it from a number of different perspectives. This talk is not going to be specific to AI, but as you'll hear, there is an element in there that hopefully can spark a bit of discussion or a bit of thought about some of the issues, especially around algorithms, and the appropriate role of regulation and who's best suited to deal with some of these issues, because we've just gone through, I think, a really interesting experience in Canada, a bit of a case study in the attempts to regulate large technology companies, showing, I think, at a time when there's a lot of interest and emphasis on regulation, highlighting some of the challenges that exist as well. So we're going to try to talk a bit about that. If I'm going to try to share my screen, which should allow me to share my slides. We tested this just before we got going, and I'm reasonably confident this will work. Okay, here's the slides. If it is not working, if someone can just jump on and let me know. The way this particular system works, I can see the slides. I can't see the chat at the moment. So, but if someone wants to just jump in and intervene, that's fine. But I'm going to assume everything is good. Okay, so the title of the talk, as you can see, is The Challenge of Internet Regulation, Finding a Balance Between Confronting Online Harms and Freedom of Expression. And I'll start just by noting that from a Canadian perspective right now, we are seeing an enormous amount of regulation when it comes to internet-related and digital policy issues. And I suspect that the same may well be true in Brazil. I know that we are seeing governments really around the world become increasingly aggressive about technology regulation, particularly some of the large technology companies. That encompasses certainly AI, but of course not limited to AI. It incorporates as well privacy-related issues, competition issues, cultural-related issues. All are kind of part of that broader umbrella. And in Canada, we've had a government that for many years was emphasizing the importance of innovation. And so we're, I think, fairly reluctant to become very prescriptive when it came to regulations for technology companies. There were exceptions, of course. Good exceptions would include privacy. So we had privacy rules as an example. But on many other issues, there was the view that overly prescriptive regulation could have a negative impact on innovation. We've seen, as I'm sure many of you know, I think a real swing in the pendulum. We've really moved in many ways to the opposite end of the spectrum, where governments are now very often anxious to regulate. And in Canada, we've seen this play out with a number of bills. Canada bills that start in the House of Commons start with a C. That's why you see several bills that have a C in front of them. The one that we're going to talk about tonight is Bill C-10, which sought to reform the Broadcasting Act. But we've had other bills introduced as well. Bill C-11, which sought to upgrade Canada's privacy legislation, make it a little bit more like Europe's GDPR. There's also Bill C-36, which was introduced quite literally in the last hour before the Parliament took a break for the summer, which deals with online hate. And then there are a whole series of areas where the government has either promised legislation or has consulted or is actively moving in the direction of new regulation. So that would include dealing with online harms. So online hate would be a subset of that, but there's a concern for issues, say, around misinformation and other harms that might arise online. There has been discussions as well about dealing with news and platform regulation, in particular, whether or not the large platforms, particularly Google and Facebook, should be required to pay for linking to news services that many of their users engage in to help support the media. There has been copyright-related reforms as well, which often deal with issues like, for example, in Canada right now, around things like copyright term, whether Canada should extend its term of copyright. We are currently at life of the author plus 50 years, and we reached a trade agreement with the United States and Mexico, an updated NAFTA, USMCA, that compels Canada to extend the term of copyright. There are also issues around platform liability, website blocking, lately a lot of discussion around tax. In fact, just 5 days ago in Canada, sales taxes began to be applied to streaming, digital services engaged in streaming activity, for example, like a Netflix type service, but there is also talk of additional kinds of taxes that might be levied. So this is a very, very active area right now in Canada from a policy perspective. We are going to essentially use Bill C-10 as a bit of a case study to talk a bit about what has been taking place and some of the challenges that exist. I should note one brief caveat, though, is that, as I mentioned, Canada, the Parliament just took a break for the summer. There is an expectation that the government, led by, in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, will call for an election likely late in the summer or early in the fall. That would be our summer. So late in August or in September. And if that does happen, then any of the bills that have not yet been passed will die. And will have to be reintroduced and restarted. And so that will include Bill C-10. So this story about what took place with respect to Bill C-10 is in some ways an opportunity to talk a bit about sort of the life cycle of a piece of legislation that at this stage is likely to die. And as will become clear from my discussion, I actually think that's a pretty good thing. But nevertheless, as I was very active on this bill, but nevertheless, just so that you have that framing in mind and understand that we're talking about a piece of legislation that became a major political story in Canada, but at this stage seems likely, things can change, but seems likely to die. Okay, so Bill C-10, well, there is a long history of how do we regulate internet video services, internet audio services as well. In fact, in Canada, we could go back, in theory, all the way back into the 1990s when our broadcast and communications regulator began looking at some of these issues. But for our purposes, the story gets interesting back in November, so less than a year ago, when the government introduces this Bill C-10. And the bill, I have to say, is not particularly controversial. This is the headline that came from one of the leading newspapers in the country. It's just descriptive, obviously, that the bill targets online streaming services. And that's largely what the government wanted to communicate. It wanted to argue that services like Netflix or some of the other large services, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, and some others, they argued were very similar to conventional broadcasters and should be regulated in a similar way, and that they were going to update Canadian law in order to try to do that. The bill was not particularly controversial when it was introduced, and frankly was not controversial for months. And I will admit that some of that is despite my best efforts. So I was fairly critical of this legislation really from the moment I had the chance to read it and study it. And so I wrote many newspaper pieces. I did a 20-part blog post series on it. I have a podcast. I did some podcast episodes on it. I appeared before House of Commons committees studying it. I did public debates on it with various people. So I was pretty vocal, but honestly, nobody really seemed to care. And so this bill was very much headed to be passed. It had really support, quite frankly, from all the various parties. And it was going through hearings, but it didn't seem like anything was going to stop it. And then suddenly, just over 2 months ago, something happened to change that discussion. So a bill that was relatively obscure, that was not getting attention, was suddenly the subject of front page stories in our media, with stories about the intent of the bill being censorship. Our senators, when this bill made it to the Senate, and we'll talk a bit about that in a few moments, described the bill as Orwellian, and indicated that they were not comfortable simply passing it quickly, that they believed it needed a lot more careful study. In fact, our leading opposition party, which is now the Conservative Party, they used to be in government before Trudeau, made this one of their major issues. And so for the last couple of months, they have been fundraising off it. They have been running commercials on it. They raised it almost every day in our parliament. And they ran these kinds of stories about promising to repeal this legislation if, in fact, it was passed. And this has become so much of a political story that I think it's fair to say that if we do get an election, as I say, we expect, this will become a major political issue. Probably not just this bill, perhaps the more broad framing of tech regulation. But it's quite clear that Bill C-10 will be part of the discourse as well. So how does a bill go from relative obscurity and certainly not a particularly controversial bill to one that becomes a major political story, which takes up weeks and weeks of discussion, generates many, many headlines, and ultimately may become part of a focal point within an upcoming election? Excuse me. So how does that happen? Well, let me start by talking a bit about, sorry, I got something in my throat. Let me start by talking just a little bit about what is in the bill. And I know that broadcasting law isn't really what you're focusing on, but it's helpful, I think, to understand what the government sought to do within the bill as a starting point, and then talk about the shift that occurred that began to get the public's attention. So as a starting point, the government took the existing Broadcasting Act, which would cover television and radio primarily, conventional broadcasters, and said they were going to expand the scope of the law to now include online, what they called online undertakings, which really were any audio or visual service operating online with some Canadian connection. So as long as there was some amount of Canadian revenue or Canadian subscribers, if you were a streaming service, if you were a podcasting service, if you were even a news site that offered up streaming content, you theoretically could find yourself subject to these Canadian rules. So it was a very big expansion. The government could have said, we want to ensure that there are effective rules to cover online services, and said, well, we think it's different enough from broadcasters that we need its own set of rules. But that's not what they did. They said, we want to take our current rules for broadcasters and now expand or extend them to all of these other kinds of services. And they really based that approach on two key claims. The first was that they argued that they were going to level the playing field. They were going to make things equal for radio and television services and for internet services, arguing effectively that those internet services had an unfair advantage because they were not facing some of the same regulatory requirements that the conventional broadcasters were facing. The reality, at least in my view, is that that is a bit of a simplistic argument. It can be effective, but I don't think it's entirely accurate. The truth is that existing broadcasters have a whole series of regulatory advantages within that system that can be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And so while they face some regulations and some costs, there are some real benefits as part of that as well. The internet-based services simply don't face any of those kinds of things. They don't have those benefits, but they also don't face some of the costs. The other element, and this is one that's probably more important and may resonate more with you, was that the government had adopted very much of a targeting the web giants approach. In fact, they rarely even call the technology companies by their name. They rarely talk about Google or Facebook or Netflix. They talk about web giants, sometimes web behemoths. So it's a fairly pejorative term. They're trying to suggest these are these big, all-knowing, very powerful companies, and the argument was that these companies were operating unfairly, unethically, and this was an attempt to try to, as I say, bring them within the scope of regulation. Now, how did they seek to do that? There were a number of different conditions, and while they started by saying they were not going to require them to be licensed in the same way that they might license a broadcaster, a television broadcaster, or a radio station, they said instead they will simply require registration. The framing was such that many of the same kinds of rules were the same. It was a little bit of a distinction without a difference. There's arguing that there are differences. The differences were not all that significant. So some of the requirements included would include mandated payments, so requirements that these companies pay a percentage of their revenues from the country into funds that would help support Canadian content. It is worth knowing that these companies already do invest very heavily in Canada. Netflix has spent more than $2 billion in Canada on licensing and on production since 2017, over the last 4.5 years. So they spent a lot of money in Canada already. They do so not because they are legally required to do so, but because Canada is, I guess, a country they feel is worth investing in. But nevertheless, this would require them to make those payments, and they would not have control over how that money is spent. They would pay it into a fund. Others could use that. It would also require data disclosures, so that there would be requirements that these companies would have to disclose everything from their algorithms to their subscriber numbers to their revenue numbers, the kind of information that they have often been reluctant to disclose. They don't, even on a public basis, typically make that available. And the other element that does bring in AI issues, or at least algorithmic issues, in a really interesting way, was what was described as discoverability requirements. And the companies, of course, would argue that they are incentivized to provide or to display the content that they think the user is most likely to want to see. If you're a subscriber to Netflix, Netflix is going to show you potential new programs that you have not yet watched that are similar, or that they believe, based on their algorithms, you are likely to like, based on your past viewing habits. That's, of course, quite different from conventional broadcasting, where the program is available at a certain time of the day, a certain time of the week, and unless required to do so, unpopular content might be buried or not available at a particularly popular time. The government's desire was that they wanted to have the regulator ensure that the Canadian content would be more discoverable, more findable, and the way they would do that would essentially to have the regulator interject into the algorithmic choices by mandating that certain Canadian content appear and be made available. So effectively, it's intervene in the algorithm to ensure that what people see as terms of choices are, at least in part, what the government or the government regulator would like them to see. They can, of course, click on whatever they like, but nevertheless, it's the government stepping in to play a significant role there. That's the starting point. The reality is, though, that even this legislative approach was more complicated than the government wanted to suggest. So, for example, if you start from the position that you say, okay, we are going to take the Canadian broadcasting system and extend it to the entire world, you're effectively saying that it is all now one system. The whole world is part of the Canadian broadcast system. And that actually had an impact on some long-standing Canadian broadcast policy priorities. So, for example, our laws have long said that the broadcasting system should be Canadian owned. It's hard to maintain that if the system now includes Netflix and Disney and a whole series of other large foreign services. They're clearly not Canadian owned. And so either you have the system and you say they're part of it, but it's no longer Canadian owned, or you say that they're not part of the system. But it's pretty hard to argue both. And so the government sought to remove that, so there was a cost to be paid. And you had similar kinds of issues with the predominance of Canadians in the programs, with Canadian ownership of the intellectual property. There were a number of issues that arose. There were as well, I should note, jurisdictional questions. On what basis would Canada tell a Brazilian streaming service that it's entitled to regulate that service? I mean, we have a decent-sized Portuguese-speaking community in Canada, and so a streaming service might find a number of subscribers, a bit of an audience in Canada, but does that mean it's now should be subject to Canadian law as part of that? At least that's the question. The government's response to some of those questions was, well, we are going to establish thresholds so that only the largest of those services are captured, but they never provided any detail. They never provided any indication of where those thresholds would be, which I thought raised concerns, leaving much of that to the regulator, to our CRTC, which left a lot of people concerned as well, because that regulator is not elected, and there are concerns in many instances about how it runs its processes, and so real questions about handing over so much power to the regulator. And then there were also concerns about the implications for speech. So licensing in a broadcast world, giving requiring that only people who have a license can be broadcasters, obviously has a speech regulation element. And that's viewed as important because of the power of the broadcaster, because of limited spectrum. There's a number of reasons why we might want to do that. The question becomes, does that apply in the internet world where anybody can effectively be a broadcaster? I have a podcast. This is being streamed and effectively broadcast online through YouTube. Are we all broadcasters now, or the organizers broadcasters by virtue of this? And should they be subject to regulation? I mean, this is a perfect example. Obviously, people watching this are largely based in Brazil. I'm here in Ottawa, in Canada. Is this Canadian content? I'm Canadian, but it's a Brazilian sponsored event. The participants are in a number of different places. The platform is based in the United States. It's not entirely clear, and injecting all of that to some form of regulation raises some significant questions along the way. So there were complications, but the political battle that sparked these kinds of headlines really starts with a slightly different issue. So the government did start by saying they're going to regulate everyone and then establish some thresholds. As I said, we don't know what those thresholds would be. But what they excluded was user-generated content of the sort that we're engaged in at the moment. And they had two exceptions for that. So they said, we only want to get after the larger players, or at least the kind of content that looks more like a conventional broadcaster. And so they said, the way that we will do that is to exclude users. And they tried to do it in two ways. First, an exception that said users would not be treated as broadcasters, so that there would be no requirement to appear before the regulatory agency in the same way that a broadcaster might be asked to appear. The other exception was to exclude their content, so to say that the content itself would not be subject to regulation in the same way that a program would be subject to regulation. So to use, again, this particular event as an illustration, this is being broadcast on YouTube. The organizers would not be treated as broadcasters for the purposes of this law. And at least with the initial exception, this content, this lecture, would not be treated as a program subject to regulation either. But along the way, about 2 months ago, the government made the decision to remove one of those exceptions, the one that exempted the content, so that by removing that exemption, suddenly now this content, this particular stream, for example, would be treated as a program under the law subject to CRTC regulation, subject to regulation by the Canadian regulator. Now, the reason they did that was that some in the music industry argued that there's a lot of music on YouTube, and many of you know that there is, and they said that if you have this exemption for user-generated content, there will at times be music on some of those videos or some of those streams, and you are exempting them from payment in those circumstances. Now, it turns out, given that this bill is unlikely to go forward, that they wanted a little bit of extra money from YouTube, and along the way lost what might have been a far larger pot of money that this legislation might have provided. But in any event, that was at least professed to be the motivation, that they wanted to ensure that it was more broadly encompassing, and they targeted what they argued was a loophole, but in effect, it created a much bigger loophole. And so the concerns, I think, came up almost immediately. And I should note, I was intimately involved in a lot of this, interviewed, I think, hundreds of times, wrote dozens of posts, which you can find on my website about this, did podcasts, appeared again before the committee. So was very, very active on this issue. In fact, when they removed that exception, I remember the day very well because I had received my first COVID vaccine dose the day before, and I was not feeling great the next day. I was happy I got the dose, but didn't feel physically all that great. And I got some messages from people saying, you need to pay attention to what just took place at committee because they just removed this exception. And I didn't have the energy at first, but later in the day, I did take a look. I saw what had taken place. And so I blogged about it, and that blog sort of created a bit of a cascade of attracting a lot of attention. The focal point of now regulating user-generated content in this way focused quite a bit on the issue, first, whether or not it was going to encompass even just basically what anyone could say. And the government said, no, we're not going to do that, but we are going to regulate around this issue of discoverability. So what that meant was they were going to continue to regulate user-generated content, even for the purposes of these algorithms in terms of what gets displayed. So it wouldn't just be a curated service like a Netflix, it would also cover services like a YouTube. Now, there are other countries, I don't know the situation in Brazil, but in the European Union, for example, where there is an audiovisual directive, they do have some of these kinds of rules with respect to a curated service like a Netflix, where they control the content. They expressly exclude user-generated content. So this would be the only example of doing that really anywhere in the world. And critics, myself included, argued that the effect of engaging discoverability requirements, of playing with the algorithms by the regulator, even on a service like YouTube, would have the effect, obviously, of prioritizing some content, making it more discoverable, but by definition, that would deprioritize or demote other content that was less likely to be found. And the argument was that if you covered all speech in this way, anybody posting to TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, you are effectively impacting their expression rights, because expression was not just the right of what to be said, but also associated with that, the right to be heard, and that people would potentially find your content and find what you have to say. And that if the government was interfering with or impacting the ability or the likelihood that people would hear what you had to say, that too had expressive elements. The debate unfolded over a number of months. There was certainly concerns as to whether or not it was compliant with Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, questions about how our regulator would exercise some of these powers, and then even concerns about how all of this would be enforced, with those of the view that, well, you weren't going to regulate, let's say, me or any individual directly, because we weren't being treated as a broadcaster. By deputizing the platforms to enforce this, the government was doing indirectly what it could not do directly in terms of that kind of speech regulation. So this caused an enormous amount, as I say, of discussion, a fair amount of controversy as well, leading to a whole series of political maneuvers in Canada. And so just to bring you up to date on where we are at the moment, within the committee study of this bill, you had the opposition party, as I mentioned, become very vocal, very active on this issue. They made the determination to ask many more questions, to introduce amendments, to generally delay much of the review, but also, I think, engage in the kind of analysis that probably should have been done from the very beginning. The government, sensing that this was going to be delayed and concerned about the prospect of an election call, then sought to cut off debate. And so, ironically, on a bill where the debate was around freedom of expression, cut off that expression to saying no more debate. And ultimately, just a couple of weeks ago, passed the bill in the House of Commons at 1:30 in the morning. So in the middle of the night, not a lot of people paying attention, certainly at 1:30 in the morning, the legislation passes. It then goes to our Senate. So in Canada, the bill has to be passed by both houses of Parliament, the House of Commons and our Senate. And once it got to the Senate, it became very clear very quickly that the senators, who are not as directly politically aligned, had been following much of this debate and had their own sets of concerns. And that many senators, even those that would typically align themselves more with the government, were of the view that this required much more study. In fact, a relatively new senator appointed by the Prime Minister Trudeau, David Adams Richards, who is a well-known author in Canada, was one of the very last to speak, and I put his quote on this slide. "This bill doesn't need amendments, it needs a stake through the heart," basically saying this bill needs to die. So the Senate refused to expedite. They have now taken a break for the summer. If there is an election call, this bill will die. So let me conclude with just a couple of thoughts of takeaways from this, and then I'm happy to engage in some questions. The first is that I think the Canadian situation highlights some of the limits of taking on big tech or technology companies. And I would say that prior to this incident, the Canadian government was of the view that they could do no wrong, at least right now, in going after the Googles and Facebooks or Netflix's or Amazon's, I guess, of the world. They were that these companies had a negative perceptions in the broader public, even though their services are, of course, wildly popular with the public. But they nevertheless thought this is an opportunity. And so almost everything that they were thinking about doing, if you think back to my earlier slides, was all framed around we're going to combat and take on big tech. And I think that this incident highlights that while there is public support for more regulation for technology companies, there are limits. And once there are encroachments on people's fundamental rights and freedoms, that is when the public is going to say, hold on a second, I'm not totally comfortable with the direction that you're going in. That's certainly the experience we saw here. Also, I think we saw that part of that world of tech regulation involves speech regulation. It's not just about limiting the power of these companies, although we ought to be thinking about doing that, and ways to do that include antitrust or competition laws. But once you start getting into the content, and that of course comes up in everything from misinformation to hate to cultural sovereignty type issues, then you are getting into speech regulation. And those are going to be fraught with real challenges, constitutional challenges, fundamental freedom challenges as well. It is not a simple process in the way that I think our government envisioned it. Thirdly, I think this really opened the public's awareness, or opened the door to the public's awareness around some of the algorithmic choices that are out there. And I think there's a great deal of momentum around more algorithmic transparency so that the public should know, or better know, how some of these algorithms are arrived at, how some of the choices are made. But that is not the same as saying that government should be making those choices, or even recognizing at times, of course, that the companies are making some of these choices as well. So there's often concerns about these algorithms and the choices that the companies make. Some would say, well, that requires more transparency. This solution was less about transparency and more about substituting the government's choice for the company's choices. And I think the response of many was to say, we're not any happier with the government making some of the choices around what these algorithms might look like than we are with the tech companies. And so anyway, worth highlighting. Finally, I think it is really worth noting, and this, I'd be curious what's taking place in Brazil, but in Canada, we have seen not just a shift, a swing of the pendulum in terms of technology regulation, so that they're much more aggressive about regulating tech in Canada. But beyond that, the other thing that we are seeing right now is that this issue itself is being framed much more as a cultural sovereignty issue. And so previously, this was largely about economic policy. The responsibility for internet or digital policies traditionally rested with our industry minister, now called our innovation, science and industry minister. And it was largely through that lens that we were addressing these issues. Today in Canada, most of these issues seem to now reside within the Department of Canadian Heritage, which is our culture ministry. And so this notion that these issues are now cultural sovereignty issues, as opposed to economic issues, have enormous implications for some of the kinds of policy choices that get made. Because if your lens is no longer about innovation or economic opportunity, or what this would mean for the economy or for access, I mean, the whole range of different issues, and is instead more of a cultural question about what does this mean from an existential basis for our own culture and almost our own sovereignty, you often will arrive at very different answers. And so by framing it in that way, by putting that department as the responsible ministry, we have seen a dramatic shift in the dialogue. But, and I'll conclude with this, C10 also teaches us that some of the same kind of core fundamental freedoms and policies that would govern regardless of whether this is viewed as an economic issue or a cultural one are still there. And governments that ignore those basic rights ignore them at their peril. So with that, I will stop. I think I'm right on about 30 minutes or so that I was asked to speak. I'll stop sharing, and happy to open it up for discussion.
That's wonderful, as we expect. So it's very interesting how Canada is dealing with that, because here in Brazil, we are facing some of this debating regarding especially fake news and some of control mechanism regarding fake news projects of law. And before that, we have here in Brazil, Marco Civil da Internet, so-called in Portuguese, Marco Civil da Internet, which is a law that intends to guarantee fundamental rights and freedoms within the internet. So we have, but this topic of algorithms choices and freedom of expression, it's so far away of our legislation in Brazil. That was a wonderful insight. Thank you so much. I give the floor to Professor Cristina, please. Thank you so much, Professor Cristina, also.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Geist. First of all, thanks so much for making time for us. It was a wonderful presentation. I took a lot of notes here, and I have 3 questions, and I promise that I will be very brief. The first one, we could see that there is a lot of rush to pass this bill, and there are political interests involved in this debate. It's also true that the Broadcast Act hasn't been updated for about 30 years in Canada. But this work of updating the legislation could not be done so quickly. We know that it takes time to design a newer legislation that regulates new technologies, that regulates, in fact, a new reality of our society. So it seems like they should scrap and start from the beginning. So my first question is, do you agree with this, that they should scrap and start from the beginning? Or do you think that the C10 needs significant changes, but we could maintain it? The second one is, the main concern is that the bill has gone too far in terms of regulating the internet, and the bill C10 gives the CRTC too much regulatory power, regulatory reach. And the legislation leaves the door open for the possibility of regulating user-generated content. Maybe it would be better to have a clear legislation rather than leave it up to the discretion of the CRTC. So, as Zygmunt Bauman states, in society we try to balance freedom, and in this case, freedom of speech and security. Do you think that Bill C10 reflects a libertarian paternalism in Canada, whose theorists argued that since people were such bad decision makers, we should nudge them in the direction of their own desired goals by orchestrating their choices so that they are more likely to do what achieves their own ends? So in summarizing it, the government is guiding people now in Canada, is trying to guide people there. And the last but not the least, the supporters of Bill C10 argue that there is a lot of local artists and the producers being left unsupported while internet giants dominate. Under Bill C10, internet streaming companies operating in Canada would have to promote Canadian content and financially contribute to local production. Okay, but why they need to do so? Wouldn't it be easier if a government allocates the tax money directly to creator programs? And this is my last question. So, well, thanks again for your presentation, for your time. It was a great pleasure, Professor Geist, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those questions. They're great. They're the same kinds of questions I've been asking myself, and others have been asking as well. So they're really excellent. And I would start, it wasn't even the question, but the speed with which we did this, I mean, is an interesting observation. I agree with you. I think that the government moved quick. Well, once they introduced the law, they moved very quickly, and they did not conduct the kind of extensive study and were not as open as they should have been to reforms. And they paid the price. And had they engaged in a broader consultation and discussion during that lawmaking process, the mistake, so-called, that they ultimately made with user-generated content might not have arisen. They might have better understood how that was a critical, essential part of the legislation and not have been as quick as they were to remove it. Since they only heard, arguably, only one side of the story, the side that was saying, take it out so that we can get paid more, they failed to identify the risks that they ultimately ran into. So I do think the speed is a good point. I would be of the view that they should scrap it and restart. And I don't think I'm alone in that regard. I'm hopeful that the fact that the bill's likely to die, that we've entered into our summer period now, holds the benefit of sort of cooler heads prevailing. People becoming a little less animated about this issue. It's not that Canadians get so animated, but on this issue, there were a lot of people. It became quite heated, sometimes quite personal. Opportunity to remove ourselves a little bit from that, I think, would be a good thing. And I would hope that even if the government is reelected, and right now in the polls it suggests that they will be, that they don't simply just come back with the same legislation, which, there were attempts early on to characterize critics as being extremists or, just simply trying to represent big tech companies. I don't think that's accurate. I think that the concerns were legitimate, and I think that the wide range of critics, from former regulators to authors and the like, reflects the fact that these are legitimate concerns that were raised that needed to be better addressed than they were. And I guess so I have some hope that they may come back and rethink that, but I suppose we will see. Your second question was really good. It raised a couple of issues. First, I would note that I do think that one of the real faults of the legislation was that there was far too much uncertainty associated with it. And so that, legislation, you would hope, would actually clarify potential uncertainties and leave all stakeholders with a better understanding of both their rights and responsibilities. And if anything, this legislation created more confusion and uncertainty, not less. And so by leaving so much to the regulator, I think both made the legislation vulnerable to criticism, but I think it also really did raise a lot of serious questions that there were no good answers for because nobody really knew. So it certainly opened the door for critics to say this is a possibility under this legislation. There wasn't really a good response other than to say, no, don't worry about it. The regulator would never do that. But we don't know that. And I think the concerns were legitimate. And had they provided a bit more of a prescriptive approach, they might have avoided some of that. As for whether or not this is the government nudging, I think there's an element to that, although I don't think that's the prime driver. I think, frankly, the prime driver, and there's a bit of irony in all of this, are some of the larger, older cultural lobby groups who I would argue have sometimes struggled to adapt to the online environment, and at a minimum are of the view that the same rules should apply. So we were getting support in the old system, we should be getting the same kind of support in the new system. And one of the ironic aspects of all of this is that there are many digital first creators in Canada, people who are using YouTube or TikTok or Instagram and making a living out of it, being very successful doing it online. They are the least likely to benefit from this legislation. They aren't going to be getting new money from any service. They don't fall within the typical definitions. They don't need new discoverability requirements. They've been successful because their work is discoverable. And so the irony here is that the successful individual creators are not being represented well. And instead, their success is now causing the groups that may not have been as successful online to say, we should get a piece of this pie. We should get paid essentially based on your success. And I find that to be quite inequitable. And the fact that the government didn't even really hear from many of these players, I think, is really problematic. So I think the driver is frankly just more loud lobby voices for government, less about trying to please the Canadian public or nudge the Canadian public, more about trying to simply meet the demands of a very vocal lobby group. And I should note that, especially with this nudging issue, I mean, it's true that in the conventional television world, at least in Canada, that sometimes those nudges are needed for Canadian content. And so Canadian broadcasters have to air a certain amount of Canadian content if they are licensed as part of their license. They have a tendency, especially for dramatic programs, dramas and things like that, to put them during the least popular times when someone might be watching. This is, of course, in the days before people would stream or record anyway, so it doesn't really matter when it's on. But if we park that to the side, the idea was it would go there. They were doing this as an obligation, not because they thought it would be particularly popular. It was usually US programs that were much more popular and much more profitable. And so those would be the ones that would be at the times most people are watching television. In the internet, it's very different. Netflix, to give one example, has no incentive not to show you content that they think you would want to watch. And so if people really did want to see Canadian content, and I'm sure there are some people that do, it's in Netflix interest to show those people Canadian content. Otherwise, they may choose not to subscribe. That's a very different model. And yet the attempt is to bring the old model of regulation into this new model, and it just doesn't work very well. Finally, you mentioned the local creators, and I highlighted them a moment ago, how there's been that success. I completely agree. This model is really a cross-subsidy model, where success in one sector suggests that, well, you should be now providing support for another sector. I think it is a more compelling argument to say that all companies operating in Canada need to contribute appropriately, and the way that most companies contribute appropriately is through tax. And so why not ensure that they pay their fair share of tax? And if the government wants to invest some of those tax revenues in these programs, well, that's an open, transparent way of doing it that meets those needs and meets the needs of getting them to contribute and doesn't create the kinds of distortions that this proposed bill does.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Geisman, and it's really interesting, this debate. Thank you.
Sure.
I totally agree. So I will give the word to Evandro, Professor Evandro, our friend who also coordinates this group.
Oh, thank you, Cynthia. Thank you so much, Dr. Geis. It was excellent presentation. It's really a hot topic, this one, because for me, sometimes it has a lot of political agenda on it. I don't follow that much, but everyone knows Mr. Trudeau is from the Liberal Party, and that's a typical liberal agenda too. But in any way, those services, if I may compare, they somehow change the way we live. Uber is a similar, in some ways, a similar service, and Airbnb is a similar service. They all go around a web interface, and they please you as you wish, different from the traditional model. Do you think that we should have perhaps a broader legislation to cover those general aspects of services from the web, international services, I would say, put this as an agenda first, and then try to slice the web piece as a piece? Because I believe that what the senators or the politicals try to do is to minimize maybe the negative aspects to the society these services might bring. We don't see that many negative aspects right now, but what do you think of this idea of getting an umbrella agenda first, like cover all those aspects similar to those services, and then get down to the specific points?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I think you raise a really important point about both the benefits that come from these services, but also some of the risks and potential harms that come from them. And that in today's environment, it of course touches so many different kinds of aspects of our lives. I guess I would respond in a couple of ways. I would say first that I think that there are certain, not universal, broad-based themes of regulation that are appropriate to ensure that they do apply universally to all of these kinds of services. The three most obvious ones to me are one, we just talked about it, tax, so that the various companies, regardless of where they are operating nominally, if they're operating in my jurisdiction, there should be at least some appropriate tax payments as part of that. Second, competition laws, so that the concerns about these companies behaving potentially in an anti-competitive manner, because they can be very large and very powerful, is a real issue. I think it cuts across all of these areas. It's not just, it's an Amazon issue for certain kinds of selling, but it can be a broadcast culture issue if it's Netflix. It can be a Uber issue with respect to ride sharing. It could be Airbnb issue. It can really cut across. And so the need to ensure that our antitrust or competition laws are effective in the digital environment, I think cuts across all of these different areas. And then the third area to me that also cuts across is data protection and privacy, where it seems to me that just about all of these companies rely very heavily on data. Part of their secret sauce or success comes from accumulating large amounts of data. It makes them smarter than some of the other companies that previously existed in their spaces. And so they benefit greatly from that data, and at times, as everyone will know, may have misused or abused some of that data. And so we need to ensure that our laws and our ability to enforce when it comes to data protection are effective. So those would be at least three of the areas that I think are cross-cutting. At the same time, though, I guess my view would be that it is necessary, and you kind of hinted at it, to drill down into the specifics. And so while I think that there are certain high-level issues that are broadly applicable in the digital environment, I think there are also areas where we need to move away from the slogans of it's big tech, so we need to regulate. The reality is Netflix is just not the same as YouTube. And even though I'm watching a video on Netflix and I'm watching a video on YouTube, in the same way that I might watch it on television, the fact that the content may be very similar, or sometimes even the same, does not change the fact that there are significant differences between those services that have, I think, real-world policy and legal implications. And I think we at times do ourselves a disservice when we adopt an approach that kind of paints all of these companies with the same brush. And I think in some ways C10 is a really good illustration of that, where there was an attempt to say, well, YouTube is the same as Spotify and it's the same as Netflix, which is exactly what these companies were arguing, so we ought to regulate in the same way, failing to recognize that, in fact, no, there are big differences in the way that content is developed, who's developing that content, and therefore the kinds of rules that ought to apply in that context. So I think we need solid principles at a high level to ensure, I would say, a fair marketplace. Then once we get into the specifics, though, we can think about what our policy objectives are, and we need to shy away from thinking about these companies as kind of a monolith of big tech, because I think it runs the risk of exactly what we witnessed in Canada, where some of the policies or the laws that are developed are simply not fit for purpose.
Thank you so much. Cynthia, may I? I have another one. Dr. Geis, thank you very much for your answer. And here in Brazil, as Cynthia said, we are far away from those discussions. We are still in that controversial discussion about misinformation, fake news, deception news, all that blah, blah, blah. And I I wonder how you have solved this problem since you are now so far away from.
Yeah, we haven't solved that problem, and I don't think anybody has solved that problem. So there's no magic solution to it. I will say, and I will say that it represents a particularly difficult issue. Our government has wanted to bring forward online harms legislation that includes some of that, and initially the government wanted to move forward with very broad legislation that would cover many forms of legitimate speech, even if potentially misinforming, and that has proven very difficult. So they haven't brought forward the bill, but they've now backed away from it and tended to focus on, I think, more primarily issues around things, let's say, like hate speech or cyberbullying or child pornography, areas where the criminal law has more traditionally been involved in Canada, and so there's been an openness or a willingness to engage in that way. So I think it once you move into these areas, it can become a significant challenge. I do think, depending on the context, there are at least a couple of things we could be thinking about. One is requirements to ensure both transparency in terms of the policies of the platforms, and also the expectations that the platforms apply those policies on a consistent basis. I think part of the frustration has often been that, there's one set of rules for Donald Trump, let's say, and another set of rules for anyone else, or name your political leader. And when we end up with some of those kinds of things, I think it creates some real challenges. So it's not, I'm one that I am somewhat reluctant to have government get in and really create a lot of specific rules about what the platforms ought to be doing, other than I think that part of their responsibility is to ensure a fair, consistent application of the policies that they establish in a transparent manner, and face potential liability where they fail to do so. And I think we have many examples from many of the platforms where that may well have been the case. So that's one example. Another example of a potential solution involves advertising, so less about the posts and more about the use of misinforming, potentially political ads, especially in a political realm. And so the Canadian government, prior to our last election just a couple of years ago, created a law that was part of our Elections Act that required the large platforms to post a public database of all political advertisements, identifying both the ad, the sponsor behind the ad, all kinds of detailed, transparent information. This had a couple of very interesting effects. One was that some companies said, if that's the rules, the obligations are quite onerous and costly, and so we are going to not take any political ads at all. So it wasn't that they said we're not going to follow the law. We're simply going to say we're going to block all of that kind of advertising altogether, so that we don't have to put in. So there will be nothing to put in a database. In fact, and Google did that actually. So Google said we're not going to run during the period when this law would be applicable during an election campaign. There will be no political ads run on our site. We'd rather forego the revenue. Facebook, on the other hand, complied with the law and created the database. And so that had its own set of interesting outcomes. Because what happened was that some of the more potentially extreme kinds of ads that might be run weren't run, because people knew that they no longer had the anonymity in posting those ads, that in fact there would be public disclosure and transparency around who was running the ads and the implications of those ads. And so it proved quite effective. So I think one solution is sort of some of those transparency type mechanisms to try to bring forward some of this. But at the end of the day, the reality is that there will be misinformation. I think that we can think about, where we want government to say that the public harm from misinformation is so great that we need some further action or solution. And we're seeing it right now, for example, in the context of COVID vaccines and anti-vax campaigns, and what's the appropriate response to some of the anti-vax information. My wife is a family physician, and she is out right now providing vaccinations, and she often will encounter people that will have just complete misinformation about the effect, and they will say, "Oh, it's like my arm is a magnet," and all kinds of stuff. I saw it on Facebook, or I saw it on YouTube, whatever. And so clearly I think these platforms have some responsibility to try to address those issues. Whether or not it's about the government stepping in and mandating that, or finding ways to work more effectively with the platforms and ensuring that they take those steps and do what they say they're going to do, I think those are issues we're still trying to sort out. But it's a long answer to a short question, and it basically kind of comes down to I don't think anybody has a solution, but what we need is this kind of experimentation. We need to play with different kinds of potential solutions and try to learn from the outcomes.
Thank you so much. Really, you highlighted our end of afternoon here. Okay, Thank you.
That was wonderful. And see, it seems that all regulations now, laws here, also data protections laws, artificial intelligence laws, strengthen the transparency and accountability, as Professor Geis was saying. So you have to be transparent and ensure that you are applying the law, and demonstrate that you are applying the law, as the accountability principle is stated in many of modern laws. So I think we unfortunately have to end. So I'll give you a minute or so to say the final words.
Okay, sure. So I would just thank you for the questions, and thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to get to see you again, even if it's mediated through the internet, and very nice to meet everybody else. It's a pleasure, and hopefully we'll have a chance sometime in the future to do this face-to-face.
Cristina, say.
Everything was wonderful. I have some points that I will need to reflect and to think about, because we have some questions about data variance, about this, and ethical principles, and so much things that we need to discuss and think, because we don't know which is the best design for a law, to regulate these great questions that we have now. So it was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank for your time.
Evandro.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. Excellent, awesome lecture. I think he made the point that transparency in one law for all, that's all we need. Thanks a lot.
And that's very interesting, because I'm sorry, I just noticed that we have a question in the chat. João Pedro, Professor Geis, he's asking if it's this international regulatory perspective. Will it be possible? Are we going to see an international regulatory in this matter effective?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's I think long been the dream of many to say that what we need are international solutions for an environment that feels very international. I think the answer is that there are some areas where we can achieve some amount of consensus, and where consensus is really valuable. Tax actually is a really good example, where we have just now seen real efforts to develop global standards when it comes to some of these digital tax issues, recognizing that it's a bit of a zero-sum game, that if one country is collecting more, that may by definition mean other countries are getting less, and so fair apportionment requires some amount of cooperation. On other areas, though, I think it remains a challenge. I mean, I just think that different countries come in with different kinds of priorities, cultural, economic, and otherwise. And so having sort of one rule for them all can be difficult. But I think that having these kinds of dialogues and discussions is really an important part of this, because I think that we continue to see efforts to identify, well, what are the areas where we might achieve some amount of consensus?
That's a wonderful reflection. So thank you, João Pedro, José Faleiros Jr., Alair, and Luzinete, a lot of people that are watching us. And thank you again, Professor. Guys, I hope we see each other soon in Canada, in Brazil. That would be wonderful if we all could gather together physically, and it's certainly much more fun, but that's a great opportunity because now we could hear you, and physically it's more difficult because it's far away. São Paulo, Canada, Ottawa, but it was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.